They're trying to keep this dying system alive, but it is so polluted and so corrupted, the free market, that we're dealing with these adverse consequences. One of them is this big disparity now between the very rich and everybody else. This would not occur under legitimate capitalism, but it is happening under this fiat-based system that we have. You know, we have a whole system where you want to buy anything, you want to buy food, you need dollars. You want to pay your rent, your landlord wants dollars. You know, you want to pay interest on your mortgage, the bank wants dollars. You know, everything is in dollars. So that creates, you know, a use culture for the dollar. And people also have confidence that, you know, if they have dollars, they're not going to lose their value overnight. Now, people know they're going to lose their value slowly over time, which is why you don't just keep a bunch of dollars under your mattress. But, you know, you're not worried about your bank account collapsing in value between the time you deposit your paycheck and the time you pay your rent. So, you know, it works to that degree. But the problem with Bitcoin is that it's really a fiat, you know, cryptocurrency, in that Bitcoin derives its value from faith. It's just like people have faith in the dollar, they have faith in Bitcoin. And I think eventually faith in the dollar is going to go away, but I think faith in Bitcoin could go away much sooner because it's far more tenuous, because there's really nothing you can do with your Bitcoin. The grocer doesn't want Bitcoin. Your landlord doesn't want Bitcoin. The government doesn't take Bitcoin for taxes. It's just speculators who want Bitcoin, and they only want it because they think the price is going to go up. But when they stop thinking the price is going to go up, they're not going to want it. And then no one's going to want it, and then the price crashes.
Explain to everyone what a fiat currency is.
Sure. So there's two types of currencies. There's legitimate currency, and then there's a fiat currency. So a legitimate currency derives its value from the money that backs it up. So at one time, U.S. currency was backed by gold. In fact, the dollar was defined as a weight of gold or silver. So a dollar was actually silver or gold. Now, the government and eventually the Federal Reserve began issuing currency that was basically an IOU for gold. So the first Federal Reserve note said this Federal Reserve note is redeemable in real money, gold or silver. And if you had a $10 bill, it didn't just say $10 on it. It said this note is payable on demand, payable to the bearer on demand, $10. So the currency was an IOU for money. The money was gold and silver, which were dollars. So when people want real currency, what gives it value is not the fact that it's a piece of paper. What gives it value is that you can turn that piece of paper in for actual gold, for actual money. Now, when the government basically abrogated those promises and went off the gold standard, they repudiated the promise to pay money for Federal Reserve notes. And Federal Reserve notes became a fiat currency. And what a fiat currency means is the currency is backed up by nothing. And so what gives a fiat currency value? Because real currency derives its value from the gold and silver that backs it up. Fiat currency derives its value from faith. People accept fiat currency because they believe that other people will accept it. Now, the government helps to drive that faith, because if you want, you have to pay your taxes in fiat currency. So if you don't want to go to jail like my dad, you better collect that fiat currency to give it to the U.S. government every year because they demand it.
And this has been going on for a while, but it's going to end sooner or later. At some point, there will be a last stimulus check. At some point, you have to pay your rent. And at some point, there will be no more PPP loans. After all of that happens, as someone that's predicted the 2008 financial crisis, what do you think will happen in the long term?
Well, first of all, the greater problem isn't that those loans stop or that money stops, but that it continues, because it's doing tremendous damage to the economy. This is an example too, where two wrongs don't make a right. We never should have bailed out any of the banks. I said that at the time. Any banks that fail, were going to fail. They should have been allowed to fail. And investors, should have lost money. They should not have been bailed out. And the same thing with the COVID. The government should not have been bailing out anybody. Now, I think the public wouldn't have stood for this. The public wouldn't have allowed the government to order them not to work if they were going to be without a paycheck. It was only because the government said, hey, you can stay home and we're going to pay you anyway. In fact, we're going to give you more money to stay home than we used to earn when you worked. So the public was, okay, that's a great deal. But that was a bad deal for the economy. And I think if we took a better approach, we would have had a more sensible response to COVID. Maybe we would have done what Sweden did, which I think was a much better approach than the one that we have. And we're just doubling down on these mistakes now. But yes, all this money printing is a huge problem. Prices have just started to go up. This is not transitory inflation. This is protracted inflation. It's going to be far worse than the 1970s. And by the way, these rent moratoriums, not only are these things completely unconstitutional, but this is going to lead to surging rents, particularly for lower income housing, because eventually these moratoriums are going to end. A lot of these people who haven't paid rent in a year are going to get evicted. A lot of these properties are no longer going to be on the rental market because the landlords are going to be too afraid to rent them out because it's too dangerous. They're going to try to maybe convert them into condos and sell them, or maybe they'll use them themselves, or just put them on Airbnb for short-term rentals. But those lower income people who manage to find a landlord willing to take a chance and rent to them, they're going to jack these rents way up because the landlords are going to have to make up for all the rent they didn't collect and for the potential that the government's going to declare another moratorium and they're going to stop paying. So this is, again, an example. The government comes in and screws up the housing market. It's going to lead to much higher prices for affordable housing, making it unaffordable. And now the government's going to say, oh, look, there's no affordable housing. We need some new government program to deal with this, when it's the government program that created the problem in the first place.
In 2021, are there any countries that don't have fiat currency?
No, they're all fiat. And in fact, up until 1971, what happened is a lot of these currencies were backed by dollars, and the dollar was backed by gold. But before Bretton Woods, right, before we, made this deal with the world, and before Roosevelt basically took us off the gold standard initially, all the world's currencies were backed by gold. So we used to have a sound monetary system. Now we have an unsound system based on fiat. That's why we have all these problems. That's why we have all these imbalances. That's why we have all these bubbles that pop. That's why you have central banks with 0% interest rates or negative interest rates. They're trying to keep this dying system alive, but it is so polluted and so corrupted, the free market, that we're dealing with these adverse consequences. One of them is this big disparity now between the very rich and everybody else. This would not occur under legitimate capitalism, but it is happening under this fiat-based system that we have.
Do you really think in your lifetime you'll see the dollar implode?
Well, whether it goes to zero, that's a question. Maybe not, right? But let's say the dollar loses 90% of its value, right? That doesn't mean it's worthless, but it's worth 10 cents, relative to what it's worth today. Now, go back to the 1970s. When we first moved off the gold standard in 1971, during the ensuing 9 years, the dollar lost 70% of its value relative to the Deutschmark, the Swiss franc, the Japanese yen. It lost better than 90% of its value in terms of gold, because gold went from $35 an ounce to $800. So we already saw that during our lifetime. And what stopped that? What stopped the bleeding? It was the combination of Paul Volcker raising interest rates to 20% and Ronald Reagan with not only supporting the Fed with that tight money policy, but also trying to move the country, towards smaller government and less regulation and a lower tax system. So you had, that type of combination. Do you see that happening again? If the dollar starts to fall again, the way it did in the 1970s, if inflation starts to spiral again, the way it did then, and it's already higher now than it was, and it's getting worse, how could the Federal Reserve possibly take interest rates to 20% when they couldn't even take them to 2%? How are we going to get another Ronald Reagan when we just elected a Joe Biden? I mean, the country is so different than it was. I don't see how it's even possible to stop the bleeding once the wound opens up.